You're putting that inside me? The giant mail-order bride first froze. The cowboy smiled and said, "This is the biggest you will ever see." Martha Cunningham's massive hands trembled as she stared at the wooden box her new husband was opening on their wedding night. At 6 feet 2 inches, she'd frozen the moment Jesse Hartford said those words. "I need to put this inside you." The giant mail-order bride had arrived in Montana, expecting a simple cowboy with a small homestead. But when Jesse smiled and lifted something from that box, something so enormous it made her gasp, he whispered, "This is the biggest you'll ever see, Martha. And it's going inside you tonight, whether you're ready or not." What was Jesse Hartford putting inside his giant bride that made a woman who'd never feared anything in her life freeze in absolute terror? And why was this cowboy, who barely reached her shoulder, smiling like he'd just won the greatest prize in the Montana territory? But here's what Martha didn't know. The thing Jesse was about to put inside her wasn't what she feared at all. It was something far bigger, far more terrifying, and it would change everything she believed about herself forever. What could make a giant woman freeze? What was this cowboy hiding in that box? And what did he mean when he said it was the biggest she'd ever see? But let's go back 12 hours earlier, to the moment everything changed. The train station platform in Sweetwater, Montana, was crowded with merchants and ranchers collecting supplies. But every single person stopped what they were doing when Martha stepped off that train. She was used to the stairs, had been since she was 14 years old, and shot past every boy in Boston like a weed nobody wanted in their garden. 6 feet 2 inches of muscle, and curves that made society ladies whisper unnatural behind their fans. Her father used to say she was built for surviving, not for drawing rooms. Then he died and left her with nothing but debts, and a stepmother who looked at Martha like she was a piece of furniture too big to fit through the door. 3 months later, that stepmother sold everything, took the money, and told Martha to find her own way. So Martha did what desperate women do. She became a mail-order bride to a cowboy in Montana, who wrote letters about needing a woman of strong character and stronger hands. She'd cried when she read that line. Not because it was romantic, but because it was the first time anyone had made her strength sound like something other than a deformity. Now she stood on this platform with her battered trunk and her threadbare dress, scanning the crowd for Jesse Hartford, the man who'd written 4 months of beautiful letters about Montana sunsets and cattle drives and building a simple life together. The man who'd never once asked what she looked like. And then she saw him, short, maybe 5'9" on a good day, weathered face with lines around his eyes that came from squinting at the sun, calloused hands clutching a hat like he was nervous. And when their eyes met, Martha's stomach dropped because she saw it happening in real time, the realization crossing his face that his mail order bride was a giant. She braced herself for the disgust, the barely concealed horror, the stammered excuse about how there'd been a terrible mistake. But Jesse Hartford just smiled, slow and warm like honey dripping off a spoon. Then he walked toward her, and Martha noticed something that made her throat close up. He didn't care that she towered over him, didn't care that every person on that platform was staring. He just looked up at her like she was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Miss Cunningham," he said, and his voice was deep and steady. "You're even more beautiful than I imagined." Martha couldn't breathe. Beautiful. When had anyone ever called her beautiful? She looked down at this small cowboy with kind eyes and waited for the punchline, for the cruel joke, for the laughter that always came. But Jesse just kept smiling, and then he did something that broke her completely. He reached up, had to stretch to do it, and gently took her hand. "Welcome home, Martha," he whispered. And she realized he meant it. This stranger who barely reached her chin had just called her beautiful and welcomed her home. And Martha didn't know whether to cry or run. So she just stood there, frozen, while Jessie loaded her trunk onto a wagon that looked expensive. Too expensive for a simple cattle rancher. The ride to his property should have warned her. They passed acres and acres of grazing cattle, through gates marked with an elaborate H brand, past ranch hands who tipped their hats and called Jesse boss like he owned half the territory. But Martha had grown up poor, had spent the last 3 years scrubbing floors in a Boston boarding house for 75 cents a week. She didn't recognize wealth when it spread across the Montana landscape like a kingdom, until they crested that final hill, and Martha saw the house. Not a cabin, not a homestead. A 2-story ranch house with a wraparound porch, stables that looked bigger than any building she'd ever lived in, and windows that caught the setting sun like they were made of actual gold. This is yours?" she whispered, and her voice sounded small for the first time in her life. Jesse's smile faltered, just for a second. Then he looked up at her with something fierce in his eyes. "Ours," he corrected quietly. "As of this morning, it's ours, Martha." And that's when she knew. Jesse Hartford wasn't a simple cowboy. He was rich, powerful, important, and for some reason she couldn't understand, he'd chosen her. A giant woman with nothing to her name but a battered trunk and 4 months of letters, written by a railroad clerk because she could barely read. Martha's hands started shaking, because she'd learned a long time ago that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. And men like Jesse Hartford didn't marry women like her unless they wanted something. The question was, what?
The wedding happened so fast Martha barely remembered it. 1 minute she was standing in Jesse's enormous front parlor, trying not to touch anything expensive. The next she was in front of a preacher with Jesse's hand wrapped around hers, his fingers barely making it halfway around her palm, promising to love and honor until death. The only witnesses were 2 ranch hands who looked at Martha like she was a curiosity, and a woman named Clara Bennett who watched the whole ceremony with eyes like a snake sizing up a mouse. Clara was everything Martha wasn't. Petite, delicate, dressed in emerald silk that probably cost more than Martha had earned in her entire life. She had porcelain skin and golden hair arranged in perfect curls, and when the preacher pronounced Jesse and Martha husband and wife, Clara's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. After the ceremony, Clara glided over with that same cutting smile. "I'll pray for you, Jesse," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Taking in a woman like that, well, charity is a Christian virtue, I suppose. The words hit Martha like a fist to the stomach. Of course, that's what this was. Charity. Jesse Hartford pitied the giant Boston woman with nowhere else to go, so he'd married her out of Christian duty. Probably planned to stick her in the kitchen or put her to work in the fields where someone her size belonged. But if Martha expected distance after the ceremony, she was wrong. Jessie took her hand again, so gentle, like she was made of something precious instead of lumber and nails, and led her through the house. Every room was bigger than the last, polished wood floors, furniture that looked like it came from catalogs. A kitchen with a cast iron stove so new it still gleamed. "This was my mother's house," Jessie said softly as they climbed the stairs. "She designed every inch of it, built it to last." He paused outside a closed door, and something in his face changed, went distant and full of old pain. "This was going to be the nursery," he whispered. "My wife, Sarah, she died 3 years ago, her and our baby. Childbirth took them both." Martha's throat closed. She understood then. They were both broken things trying to piece themselves back together. Jessie had lost a wife and child. Martha had lost everything else. 2 damaged souls who'd found each other across 1,000 miles of loneliness and desperation. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with everything in her. Jessie looked up at her, and something passed between them. recognition, understanding, like two people who'd been walking through darkness, finally seeing another light. "Don't be sorry," Jesse said, and his voice was rough. "You're here now, Martha. That's all that matters." He showed her to the bedroom last. Their bedroom. It was huge, with windows overlooking the ranch, and a bed so large Martha wondered if it had been built special. "I'll give you time to freshen up," Jesse said, backing toward the door. "Take all the time you need. I'll be downstairs." Then he was gone, and Martha was alone in a bedroom that cost more than her entire childhood. She stood there in her wedding dress, the only decent thing she owned, borrowed from the boarding house owner, and tried to breathe through the panic rising in her chest, because she knew what came next. Had heard the boarding house girls talk about wedding nights in whispers that made it sound terrifying and painful and inevitable. And every story made Martha's stomach twist, because how could someone as small as Jesse even manage with someone like her? Would he be disgusted? Would he hurt her trying? Would he realize he'd made a terrible mistake and send her away in the morning? Her hands shook so badly she couldn't work the buttons on the back of her dress, couldn't reach them, just stood there trapped in borrowed silk while the sun set outside and shadows filled the room. That's when Jesse knocked, soft, polite, like he was asking permission to enter his own bedroom. "Martha, may I come in?" His voice was so gentle it made her want to cry. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But she managed a whispered yes that sounded like surrender. The door opened, and Jesse stepped inside carrying a wooden box. Carved, beautiful, old. He set it carefully on the bed and turned to face her, and the tenderness in his eyes made Martha want to run, want to jump out the window and keep running until she reached Boston or the ocean or anywhere she could be alone with her shame. "I need to show you something," Jesse said quietly, and he was nervous. Actually nervous. His hands trembled as he touched the box. Before anything else happens between us, I need you to understand what you mean to me." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been through this before. Different men, different cities, but always the same moment when they revealed what they really wanted. Control, submission. Proof that even a giant woman could be made to feel small and powerless and used. She braced herself as Jesse opened the box with shaking hands. And then she froze, because inside wasn't what she expected, not even close. An emerald ring sat nestled in black velvet, the stone so enormous it caught the lamplight like a trapped piece of the Montana sky. Next to it were folded papers with official seals and legal stamps that looked important. Jesse lifted the ring first, and his hands were still trembling. "This was my grandmother's," he said, and his voice cracked. "Then my mother's, then Sarah's, the woman I loved before you." Martha took a step back, then another. Tears burned her eyes and throat because of course this was about his dead wife. He wanted Martha to wear a dead woman's ring, to play house and pretend to be something she could never be. Delicate, petite, worthy of a Hartford family heirloom. "I can't," she whispered, and the words came out broken. "I can't be her, Jesse. I can't be small and pretty and everything you lost. I can't shrink myself down to fit into a dead woman's jewelry." Her voice was rising now, all the fear and shame spilling out like poison. "I'm not delicate. I'm not refined. I'm just a giant freak from Boston who can barely read, and I don't know why you married me, but I can't be what you want because I'm too much. I've always been too much, and I'm sorry, but I can't." "Stop." Jesse's voice cracked through the room like thunder. "Just stop, Martha." Jesse crossed the room in 3 strides, and even standing he had to look up to meet her eyes. His face was fierce, angry almost. But not at her, at something else entirely. "You think I want you to be small." His voice shook. You think I brought you all the way to Montana so you could shrink yourself down and disappear? Martha, I chose you because you're not small. Because every letter you wrote, every single one, I could feel your strength bleeding through the words, even though someone else was writing them down for you. Martha's breath caught. He knew. He knew she couldn't read well, and he didn't care. I could feel your courage, Jesse continued, and now he was the one with tears in his eyes. Your refusal to apologize for taking up space in this world. Your determination to survive even when everyone told you that you didn't fit. And I thought, God, I prayed, that maybe you were strong enough for what I needed. He grabbed her hands, both of them. His fingers disappeared in her palms, but he held on like she was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting. But Clara said, Martha started, and Jesse's laugh was bitter. Clara Bennett is angry because I wouldn't marry her sister, because I told her family 3 years ago that I'd never marry a delicate woman again, that I'd never watch another wife die because she wasn't strong enough to survive Montana winters and difficult births and the kind of life we live out here. The room spun. Martha couldn't process what she was hearing. What are you saying? Jesse's smile was watery and fierce and full of something that looked like desperation. I'm saying Sarah was 5 feet tall and weighed 90 pounds soaking wet. Beautiful, delicate. Everyone said we were the perfect couple because she was small enough to make me look tall. His voice broke completely. And it killed her, killed our baby. She went into labor too early, and she was so small, so fragile, and there was nothing anyone could do. I watched her bleed to death in our bed while our son died in her arms, and I swore I'd never marry another woman who couldn't survive this life. He lifted the ring, and the emerald blazed in the lamplight like green fire. This stone is the biggest in Montana territory. It belonged to my grandmother Esther, who was 6 feet tall and could outride any man in 3 counties. My mother Catherine was 5'11" and ran this ranch for 20 years after my father died. She broke horses and delivered calves and once fought off a bear with nothing but a shovel. Jesse's hands were shaking so hard the ring trembled. These women survived, Martha. They were strong. And when I read your first letter, when I felt your strength coming through those words, I knew you were like them, built for surviving, not for breaking. Martha couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her whole life people had treated her size like a curse, like something shameful that needed to be hidden or apologized for. But Jesse was looking at her like she was exactly what he'd been searching for. I don't understand, she whispered. Jesse set the ring down gently and lifted the papers. His hands were steadier now, determined. Then let me make it clear. This is the deed to half this ranch. I had my lawyer draw it up the morning after I got your first letter. Your name is already on it. Martha Cunningham Hartford. Whether you wear that ring or not, whether you ever share my bed or not, half of everything I own is legally yours. The house, the land, the cattle, the bank accounts, everything. He thrust the papers toward her, and Martha saw her name written in official script, saw the legal stamps and signatures that made it real. You're giving me half of everything. Her voice came out strangled. But why? I'm nobody. I'm just a desperate woman who answered an advertisement because I had nowhere else to go. I can't read properly. I can't do fancy needlework or play piano or any of the things wealthy wives are supposed to. I don't need fancy, Jesse interrupted, and now his voice was fierce again. I need real. I need a partner who can stand beside me, not behind me. I need someone who won't break when life gets hard. I need a woman strong enough to birth healthy children and run this ranch when I'm gone and survive Montana winters that kill people who aren't tough enough. He picked up the ring again, and this time when he looked at her, Martha saw everything. All his fear, all his hope, all the desperate loneliness of a man who'd watched his first wife die and spent 3 years terrified, it would happen again. "Wait," Martha whispered, and her voice shook. "You're putting that inside me?" She pointed at the papers with a trembling hand. "You're giving me half your ranch. You're making me your legal partner. But I just got here. You barely know me. What if I'm not what you think? What if I fail or disappoint you or—" "Then we'll figure it out together," Jesse said simply. He stepped closer, so close Martha could smell the soap he'd used and see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Martha. I'm asking you to be strong, and you've been strong your whole life. I can see it in the way you stand, the way you look people in the eye even when they're cruel, the way you got on that train and traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger because you refused to give up." He held up the ring and the deed together. "This is the biggest thing you'll ever see. Not the emerald, not the ranch, but the truth that you are worth everything I have to give, that your strength isn't a curse. It's exactly what I need, what we need to build a life that lasts." Martha's knees gave out, just completely stopped working. She dropped to the floor, and for the first time in her adult life, she was eye level with a man. Jesse knelt with her, still holding that ring and those papers like they were sacred. "I can't be her," Martha sobbed, and all the years of shame and rejection came pouring out. "I can't be Sarah or your mother or your grandmother. I'm just me, just Martha, who's too tall and too strong and too much for everyone who's ever known me." Jesse cupped her face in his calloused hands. "You're not too much," he whispered fiercely. "You're exactly enough, and I don't want you to be anyone but yourself." Then he did something that shattered every defense Martha had ever built. He pressed his forehead to hers, this small cowboy and his giant bride kneeling together on an expensive bedroom floor, and he started to cry. "I'm so tired of being alone," he whispered. "So tired of being afraid that everyone I love will break. But when I saw you on that platform, taking up space and refusing to apologize for it, I felt hope for the first time in 3 years. Please, Martha, please let me put this inside you. This truth, this partnership, this future we could build together. Let me give you half of everything I have and prove that you're worth it all." Martha kissed him. She didn't plan it, didn't think about it. Just grabbed Jesse's face in her massive hands and kissed him with every ounce of loneliness and hope and desperate gratitude that had been building inside her for 28 years. He kissed her back like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing, and Jesse's hat had fallen off somewhere, and Martha's hair was coming loose from its pins. "So about this ring," Jesse said, his voice shaky but his smile growing. "It's a bit unconventional, but I had it sized specifically for you." Martha stared at him. "How did you know my size?" Jesse's grin turned sheepish. "I wrote to your boarding house owner, Mrs. Patterson, asked for all your measurements. Wanted everything to be ready when you arrived." He slid the emerald onto Martha's finger, and she gasped because it fit perfectly. Not too tight, not too loose. Like it had been waiting her whole life to find her hand. The stone blazed green fire in the lamplight, bigger than anything Martha had ever worn, bigger than she'd ever imagined wearing. "This is really the biggest I'll ever see, isn't it?" she whispered, staring at the ring and then at the deed that made her a landowner, and then at the man who'd given her both without asking for anything in return. Jesse's smile could have lit the whole Montana sky. "Darling, we're just getting started." And then he told her everything. How his grandmother Esther had been rejected by 17 men before finding a husband brave enough to marry a woman taller than him. How his mother Catherine had run the ranch alone for 2 decades and made it more profitable than when his father was alive. How Sarah's death had broken something inside him that he thought could never be fixed. "I wrote to 14 mail-order bride agencies," Jesse admitted, still kneeling on the floor with Martha. Told them all the same thing. I needed a woman of strong character and stronger hands, someone who wouldn't break. Most of them said I was crazy, that no woman wants to be valued for her strength instead of her delicate nature. His voice went soft. But then Mrs. Patterson from your boarding house sent me your information, said you were the strongest woman she'd ever met, inside and out. Said you'd survived things that would have destroyed most people. And when I read your first letter, even knowing someone else had written it down for you, I could feel your spirit, your refusal to give up. And I knew. Martha was crying again, couldn't seem to stop. Knew what? Jessie squeezed her hands. That you were my second chance, that maybe God hadn't forgotten about me after all. He helped her stand, and Martha realized she was still wearing her wedding dress with the buttons she couldn't reach. Jessie noticed too. May I? He asked, and when Martha nodded, he carefully turned her around and began working the buttons free. His fingers were gentle, patient, like he had all the time in the world. I'm not educated, Martha whispered as the dress loosened. I can barely write my own name. The railroad clerk who helped me with the letters, he made me sound smarter than I am. Jessie's fingers paused. Martha, look at me. She turned, holding the dress against her chest. Jessie's eyes were fierce again. Intelligence isn't just about reading books. You survived losing your father, being abandoned by your stepmother, working yourself to the bone in Boston, and then having the courage to travel 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. That takes intelligence, strategy, strength that most educated people don't have. He touched her cheek. And if you want to learn to read better, I'll teach you. We've got nothing but time, and I've got a whole library downstairs. But don't you dare think you're not smart enough for me, because you're the smartest decision I ever made. Martha let the dress fall, stood there in her plain cotton undergarments in front of this man who'd given her everything. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel ashamed of her size, didn't feel like she needed to make herself smaller or apologize for existing. Jessie looked at her like she was a sunset, like she was something rare and precious that he couldn't quite believe was real. You're so beautiful, he whispered. Do you have any idea how beautiful you are? Martha shook her head because she didn't, had never seen herself as anything but too much. But Jessie was already moving, pulling back the covers on that enormous bed, taking her hand and leading her toward it like they had all the time in the world. They didn't consummate the marriage that night. Jessie just held her, wrapped himself around her as much as he could, this small cowboy and his giant bride, and told her stories about the ranch until Martha's eyes grew heavy, about the cattle drives in spring, the way the mountains looked covered in snow, the foals that would be born next month. You'll help name them, Jessie murmured against her hair. You'll help with everything. This is your ranch now too, Martha, your home, your future. Martha fell asleep wearing an emerald ring and wrapped in the arms of a man who'd chosen her strength over someone else's delicacy. And for the first time since her father died, she felt safe. 6 months later, Martha Hartford stood in the ranch yard, 7 months pregnant with a belly so large she could barely see her own feet, directing ranch hands with a voice that carried clear across the fields. No, not that pen. The calves need more space. Move them to the east pasture where the grass is better. The men jumped to obey. They'd learned quickly that Mrs. Hartford might be soft-spoken with her husband, but she ran the ranch operations like a general commanding troops. Jessie watched from the porch, grinning like a fool. He did that a lot these days. Just stood there watching his wife work with this expression of pure contentment on his face. Clara Bennett had stopped visiting after Martha won the county horse race at 5 months pregnant. Just climbed on Jessie's biggest stallion and left every competitor in the dust while the whole town watched in shocked silence. Some women, Jessie thought, were just born to be queens. And Martha was definitely a queen. She'd learned to read in 3 months, was already keeping the ranch books better than he ever had, could birth a calf, break a horse, and bake bread that made the ranch hands weep with gratitude. But more than any of that, she was happy. Jessie could see it in the way she moved, the way she laughed, the way she rested her hand on her enormous belly and talked to their unborn child about the ranch like she was introducing them to their kingdom. "What are you smiling about?" Martha called from the yard, and Jessie realized he'd been standing there grinning like an idiot again. "Just thinking about how smart I am," he called back. Martha laughed, and the sound rolled across the ranch like music. "You mean how lucky you are?" Jessie shook his head and walked down the porch steps to where his wife stood, surrounded by ranch hands and cattle and the empire they were building together. He had to look up to meet her eyes. Would always have to look up, and he'd never been more grateful for anything in his life. "Not lucky," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Smart. I was smart enough to know that the biggest thing I'd ever see wasn't a ranch or a fortune or an emerald ring." He placed his hand over hers on her swollen belly. "It was you, Martha. Your strength, your courage, your refusal to be anything less than exactly who you are." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "The biggest I'll ever see," she whispered, and they both knew she wasn't talking about the ring anymore. She was talking about the life they'd built, the future they were creating, the truth that she was exactly enough. Jessie kissed her right there in the ranch yard with all the hands watching, and nobody laughed, nobody whispered. They just smiled and went back to work, because everyone on the Hartford ranch knew the truth. Sometimes the biggest blessings come in the strongest packages. And Martha Hartford was the biggest blessing Montana had ever seen.